Good morning to you. Good morning to you. Good morning to you. Good morning, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. Well, it's another day in the neighborhood. It's another day to give God some thanks, to be alive, to be well, to be whole, to be in our right mind, all of that. So, as promised, I did say that we're going to continue our talk concerning immigration. And right now we're on Asian immigration. And then we are going to talk about this thing called Reconstruction. Reconstruction from the book Heart and Soul by Kadir Nelson. So, next week, I want to talk to you all about Nat Turner. And many people have seen seen the film adaptation of Nat Turner. Some of that is accurate, some of it is not accurate. But we are going to read a little bit about Nat Turner. And then I will recommend two books based on an author who actually really dug deep and corrected the record on Nat Turner's life through her research. So we're going to talk about that. And also a broadcast I got a chance to listen to on yesterday. We'll talk a little bit about what the broadcaster had to say. As promised, I did say that I was going to share with us, and this is specifically for my friends of color. Since we're talking about history on Tuesdays, we're talking about Black history, and we need to understand how we become disenfranchised in the voting process. So I want to begin there first because this past week, I received a letter from a conservative group. Now, my husband has gone into what conservatism actually is. The original term of conservatism actually had to do with white supremacy, conserving its power, conserving its ability to control resources in this country. Many of them, you will talk to them and they will say that that is not what it is. But all you have to do is go and look up what is conservatism and start backing into the history, and you will find out that that's what it is. All right. So this particular group calls me very often because at one point I went to this summit actually, and it was probably about 5 years ago. Because I was new to the area and I was trying to figure out what's going on up here in DC, what's going on with politics. I met a lot of good people at this particular summit. But now that I'm looking over their paperwork they just sent me, it is very clear that 5 years later, this summit is no longer directed at just the average citizen trying to find out things about voting, or to find out things about their values, or to find out things about candidates. This summit, it looks like it has turned into the suspected white supremacist clandestine Klan rally meeting. And I'm not like exaggerating when I say that. So what I've done is I'm going to read you parts of the letter. All right. And then I'm going to talk to you about this lineup of people that are going to be speaking. All right. Before we go into our piece on Reconstruction, because really, if you don't understand it yet, we are almost in what I would call a second wave of Reconstruction. We are in yet another wave of time where people are upset about supposed gains, all right, that people of color in this country have made. When again, if you go look at the data, we have maybe moved about 0.1% in several categories in 50 years. So that means that we really aren't making the gains that we thought we were making. There's been a lot of social integration, but when you talk about economic justice, when you talk about housing developments, not only are a lot of our minority people kind of pushed into ghettos, right, or pushed into urban housing, however you want to phrase it, but now even in that, they're being pushed out of there because these same neighborhoods are now gentrifying. And so they're actually tearing down the housing projects, especially I just saw when I was down in South Florida, they're tearing down these places and shifting that population again. So you have to ask yourself the question, how many times can a person be shifted out or moved around a region before you try to find a permanent solution to moving them out? All right. So I will read you the beginning of this flowery worded letter because I want you to understand how white supremacy, cloaked in political and religious jargon language, sounds. That's why I'm reading this to you. The people who are sponsoring this summit are the legislative affiliate of Family Research Council, headed by Tony Perkins, the president of Family Research Council. The other sponsor is a group called AFA Action, which is headed by Tim Wildman. Another group called American Values, headed by Gary Bauer. Another group called Christian Healthcare Ministries, headed by Howard S. Russell. The Family Research Council themselves, headed also by Tony Perkins. And a group called United in Purpose, headed by Bill Dallas. So all I'm doing is reading you who says they're sponsoring this summit. This summit is coming up September 21st through the 23rd. So that's kind of like right in the season of pumping people up before the 2018 midterm election. So let me read to you this lovely wording, and then I'm going to tell you about the speakers that are going to be there. And then I want you to honestly ask yourself, is this a values voter summit for all people, or is this a values voter summit focused on what this country has historically called Americans, which tends to be the protection of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males? Okay, so here's the letter that we got. It says, "Dear Robert and Shantae, in his mercy and under this administration, we believe God has given us a window of time to return our country to be a nation that embraces truth, one that respects and protects faith, family, and freedom." Now, I want you to think about that. First of all, they're saying that they literally believe that God has given them time to return the country to be a nation that embraces truth, that respects and protects faith, family, and freedom. So I need to ask the question, whose faith, whose family, and whose freedom? Because I'm looking at what's happening in our country, and you're saying that under this administration, God is allowing this to happen. I want you all to think about that. So when people say they want to have a logical talk with people who believe in this administration, I just read you why you can't have a logical talk with them. Because they actually believe that God has given them a window of time to roll back the clock in America. All right? Think about that. Then it goes on to say, with this reprieve, we have a tremendous opportunity as Christians to influence our nation's leaders. We do? As Christians? Which Christians? Because all of the Christians are not influencing our nation's leaders. So again, I need you to be specific, because the majority of Christians are looking on with shock and horror that the civil rights protections in this country for people of color, namely black people, all right, are being rolled back. So what Christians are influencing our nation's leaders? I'm just reading you straight from the letter they sent me, because we need to understand what time of day it is, and some of us don't understand yet. All right. So he says, the letter goes on to say, however, we must not become complacent in thinking we've prevailed and that the country is secure. Secure for who? All right. Here's the political language that is being used. Listen, the left is not going to back down from its determined agenda to undermine the very foundation of our republic. What is the foundation of our republic? And you're saying that the people who don't vote and think like you, everybody else, is called the left. I'm not kidding. This is in capital letters on this letter. So because I don't want to vote in a way that's going to harm people across this country, all right, if I don't think like you, I am now labeled as the left. And I'm not a leftist. I've never been a leftist. But according to them, anybody who is not with this program is called the left. What is the very foundation of our republic? What are they talking about? This is called coded language. If you understand the foundation of our republic, the foundation of our republic was not equal rights for everyone. All right? There were some amendments that had to be added in so that the foundation of our republic could be course corrected. All right, let's keep reading. As Christians, we must do all that we can to keep religious liberty, national security, traditional values, and the sanctity of life at the forefront of the national discussion. Understand, these 4 things are the only things these people care about. I'm going to read them for you again. Religious liberty, mainly Christians, all right, even though we don't live in a theocracy. National security, what does that mean? That means keeping people of color in line. Keeping the immigrants out. Because we're going to talk about immigration again today, so you all will see how this ties in. All right. Traditional values. What are traditional values? What are they? And the sanctity of life at the forefront of the national discussion. Good morning. So we know that sanctity of life for them almost always means anti-abortion. All right. That's what it means. Now, the second paragraph. The 2018 midterm elections will be pivotal in continuing President Trump's agenda and shaping the nation's future political landscape and our culture. So, this Christian group wants to come together and continue President Trump's agenda and shape our future political landscape and culture according to President Trump's agenda, which changes night to night. I just want us to understand, as black people in this country, what's about to go down and why you better be registered to vote for November. Listen, with a combined 470 seats in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate up for grabs, anything can happen. Yes, anything can happen. There are also thousands of gubernatorial, state legislative, and local races on the ballot, and the outcomes will affect all of us. Who are the all of us they're talking about? The people who subscribe to President Trump's agenda. We must do all that we can to guard this window of time. It reminds me of that scripture that says the enemy knows his time is short to do what he wants to do and to do what he got to do. So they end by saying, that's why we are inviting you to stand shoulder to shoulder with us at this summit. So invited speakers will include, all right, and I'm going to show you the flyer. Okay. Can everybody see that? This is the flyer of the speakers. Can everybody see that? All right. You see some familiar faces on there? Do you all see some familiar faces? All right. So these are the people that they deemed most influential to influence. All right. To influence conservative Christians. I want you to see the faces. All right. So invited speakers will include David and Jason Benham. We've actually met them. Very nice guys. They are strong proponents of the Second Amendment. Dr. Bill Bennett, Sharon Bream, Kirk Cameron. Tucker Carlson. If you've never seen, Tucker Carlson is on Fox News all the time. If you don't know who Tucker Carlson is, just go Google him and see how suspected white supremacist he is. Secretary Ben Carson. Sarah Carter. Kellyanne Conway is a speaker. Brigitte Gabriel, another young lady that I met. Very, very, very passionate about dealing with radical Islam. But guess what? Everybody in this nation is not a radical Islamist. Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Franklin Graham. You know, Franklin Graham, who keeps saying that the president is doing an excellent and wonderful job. And we can just kind of bypass all of the stuff he's doing. But he's doing a wonderful job. Ambassador Nikki Haley. She's at the UN now, starting trouble. Sean Hannity. Governor Mike Huckabee, along with his daughter, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Laura Ingraham, who recently told, I think it was LeBron James, to shut up and dribble. Senator James Lankford. Mark Levine. Dana Loesch, head spokesperson for the NRA. saying very controversial things and recently been in the news. Michelle Malkin, Eric Metaxas, Vice President Mike Pence, Speaker Paul Ryan, Representative Steve Scalise, Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro, another suspected white supremacist. Joni Eareckson Tada, and President Donald Trump himself is coming to speak at the Values Voter Summit. So, I'm going to need those of you who are going to turn 18 in the black community. I'm going to need you to be the first ones lined up as soon as you're eligible to go register. And that's all I have to say about it. They have a game plan. They're ready to galvanize white Christians to go vote their values. Any questions? Any questions? All right. Out of all the leaders in this country, you mean to tell me these are the only people that you want to speak? That's all I got to say. So, don't tell me that you are ready for a conversation that involves all Americans. You're not. All right? You're not ready for that conversation. If those are the people you have invited to speak to galvanize Christians, then clearly you don't really even care about black Christians coming to this event. I mean, at least 4 or 5 of your invited speakers are known to be hostile towards black people. Hello? All right. So, we're moving on. We're going to talk about Reconstruction. And let's see. This is an illustrative painting by Kadir Nelson of a young woman teaching her father to read. Reconstruction. All men are created equal, says that great declaration, and now a great act attests this verity. Charles Sumner, U.S. Senator, Massachusetts. When the slaves were set free, they didn't have nothing, and the old masters didn't give them anything. All those folks had a mighty hard time. They had to start from scratch. In slavery time, it was against the law for most blacks to own property. And while it was against the law for them to own property because they were property, all right, America was busy giving its white peasant class that came over, its white immigrant class that came over, they were busy handing out welfare called land to those white peasants. All right. And as we read about immigration, we saw earlier as we were reading about that even the Asians were banned from owning land in certain states. All right. So when we look at the bigger picture now of land ownership in this country, and we're trying to figure out why is so much of the land mass in our country in the hands of only one group of people? It was deliberate. It was legalized. There was legalized restriction, right? And banning of other people getting land. It wasn't like, oh, they just went out there and, as many people try to make it seem like, oh, they fought for all this land. No, they didn't fight for all this land. It was given to them legislatively by policy, and by those same policies, certain people in this country were restricted from going after possessing land. That is what happened. All right. So it was against the law for most black folks to own property. It was against the law for them to vote. And it was against the law for them to read. All of a sudden, we had to find a way to make it on our own. A few politicians had the bright idea that black people should be sent back to Africa. Now, a lot of people, for some reason, don't know this, but Abraham Lincoln believed in this plan to send black people back to Africa. And the other day, I heard several white supremacists saying that black people, in essence, did get their reparations because they had a choice to either stay here or to go back to Africa and create what we now know as Liberia. They believe that. They believe, hey, we gave y'all a chance to go back, and some of you all took it and some of you didn't. All 4 million of us. President Lincoln even seriously considered the idea before the end of the war. Even though some black folks made the trip, there was no way the government would pay to send all of those people back across the ocean. I wonder if our government would pay for it today. Besides, we didn't know Africa any more than we knew the south of France. We were born and raised in America. We were Americans by right, and America is where we would stay. Which is also very true. Why should I have to leave if my ancestors built this country? Why should I have to leave if the blood and the sweat and the tears and the labor of my ancestors built this country? Why don't you go back? Right? You have a place of origin that you know where you originated from. Nobody stole your heritage, right? Nobody kidnapped your relatives and forced you over here. Many of you came over here willingly. So why would they at that point try to send a whole generation of people back to a place they had never seen? You've erased their history. You've changed their names in many cases, right? And even if you were indigenous to America, there was still a lot of destroying of your history. So why are you trying to send me back to Africa when I may in fact be an indigenous American? Southern white folks had to start over too. Much of the South was destroyed by the war. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta were burned, abandoned, and looted by soldiers. The great wealth of the proud South was gone. Deserted Southern properties were given away, and the Confederate dollar wasn't worth a cup of red Georgia clay. All right, here's another illustration of some of the freedmen painted by Kadir Nelson. So young folks used to dig that money out of the garbage and play with it, the Confederate money that they had created. To help Southerners and freed slaves get on their feet, the government planned to rebuild the South with a series of acts called Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau, which oversaw Reconstruction efforts, gave a few former slaves about 40 acres of deserted land to cultivate and live on. So when people talk about this 40 acres, they were actually being given it. Problem was, no one told the freedmen that the land was already owned by someone else. When the true owners of the land came back after the war, President Johnson ordered the freed slaves to give the land back. So they got a promise. They were given some land, given the 40 acres, and then it was snatched back when the slave owners returned. That's the part they don't tell you about. So when people say, well, I don't know about those reparations, I don't think that's ever going to happen. The reality is it did happen. It did happen. But the promise was rescinded. Some black folks moved west to claim land and start over, or up north to work in cities. If you visit the National American Museum, the new museum that was put together in conjunction with Smithsonian, when you go in, there's an entire room dedicated to the West, showing all of the settlements of free black people that moved west. It wasn't just what was happening in Oklahoma, but it was all over the West that these townships were popping up with nothing but black people in them. They were free black people who decided to move west. All right. So most people, though, stayed and, like Pap, went to work for their old masters as sharecroppers. Sharecropping was an arrangement where workers would split the profit of a crop with the owner of the land. Old master paid for the seed, supplies, equipment, and living expenses, and told Pap he had to pay him back for his share of the expense at the end of the year. After Pap settled his debt to the owner, he would get the rest of the money owed him for the crop. It sounded like a fair deal, but it wasn't. When he and Pap settled at the end of the year, he always found a way not to pay him at all. He subtracted the cost of the seed, the food, the housing, and such from what he owed Pap, padding it here and there, figuring until it ended up with Pap owing him. Sounds like the American debt system. Jeez. Even if he wanted to, Pap couldn't say a word. The unwritten but well understood rule was never contradict a white person, no matter what. That was reason enough to find yourself strung up from a tree. There's a new lynching memorial opening in Montgomery, Alabama, April 26th. Go look it up. They actually just had the presentation of it on 60 Minutes. And the founder of it, the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson, creates this memorial, and they walk around it. They give us a little bit of preview of that memorial. And inside, he's got on the walls some of the reasons why people were lynched. Part of it, you talk back to a master. You said something that you shouldn't have said. You looked at somebody too long and you were lynched. All right. The best Pap could do was to try and make it back next year, but he never did. Sharecropping was a sneaky way of keeping black people still working in the fields without having to pay them. It wasn't much different from slavery. With the end of slavery, millions of former slaves finally had the right to learn to read, write, and figure. The Freedmen's Bureau, as we talked about last week, the Freedmen's Bureau helped set up and oversee free public schools and colleges all around the South. I don't understand why we have schools that are still predominantly black. I don't understand why we have HBCUs. Let me help you. The Freedmen's Bureau helped set up and oversee schools and colleges all around the South. Because, again, yes, you have the right to learn to read, write, and do math, but who's going to step up and teach you? Okay? Scores of Northern teachers flooded down to teach all the newly freed slaves and poor white folks who weren't able to go to school before the war. So, black people, again, taking the initiative, opened up education for free poor white people. But you won't see that in your history books. Black men also gained the right to vote, and with it, they put some of our own folks in office, even sent a few to the House of Representatives. These were very big steps, but our progress didn't come without a price. The time after the war was terrible for black folks. Even though we could vote and go to school, many of us were very poor and illiterate. Union soldiers occupied southern towns to keep the peace, but they didn't do much to protect black people from new groups of mean whites like the Ku Klux Klan, who threatened them all year long. So here's another illustrated picture of Pap sharecropping. All right. So you get released from sharecropping, and my grandmother and her mother were of this generation. So my family is not very far removed from slavery on my father's side. And while they were doing this, while they're trying to empower themselves, while they're trying to start schools, while they're trying to build their life, they get the Ku Klux Klan threatening them all year long. All right. Hats off to this generation who didn't run from anything. Exactly. Didn't know that, but they have a problem with affirmative action allowing blacks to go to predominantly white institutions. Yeah. To stop black folks from voting, which didn't stop us, Klansmen marched in front of their homes wearing white sheets over their heads, shooting out the windows and burning homes to the ground, or worse, dragging black folks out of their homes to lynch them. And still we rose. And still we went to go vote. And still we went around helping other black people register to vote. The law didn't do a thing to stop it. Shoot, some of the men wearing the sheets were the lawmen. It was their way of keeping us in our place, wherever that was supposed to be. They couldn't stand to see us trying to be equal to whites. They were convinced that they were somehow superior to black people. My grandma used to call it the sickness. Whatever it was just plain mean. Lord knows how those folks could fix it in their minds to do what they did to us back then. It's a miracle we made it through. It is indeed a miracle we made it through. After a while, the government seemed to just give up on Reconstruction. Federal troops were sent back home, and state governments wrote new laws called Jim Crow laws that divided everything by race. So when people tell me, why are you always talking about race? Why are you always talking about racism? Why do we keep having this conversation? Because this conversation was not started by us. All right? It wasn't. It was started by the ancestors that were in power that decided that they wanted to codify race. And we still see and feel the results and effects of that. So until we deal with that, the conversation is going to keep going. All right? Jim Crow laws divided everything by race. They divided restaurants by race, libraries, theaters, schools, markets, drinking fountains, you name it. There's actually now a Jim Crow museum that you can go and visit that shows you how embedded racism was in our society. There are now two Americas at this point. There is the white America and the black America. And if you want me to stop talking about it, all right, if you want me to stop talking about it, then how about you initiate a different America? All right? If you want me to stop talking about it, don't send me foolishness like this. Okay? All right. There were now two Americas, one white and one black, and the South slowly fell backward into something that looked a lot like slavery. Sharecroppers were stuck in the fields in debt to landowners. Black people lived in fear of violence. And the vote was pushed out of reach with things like poll taxes, which people had to pay in order to vote, and which were too high for most black folks. So what does a poll tax look like now? It looks like removing voting polls out of neighborhoods where you know the people will have to pay certain fees to even make it to a voting poll because it's so far removed from where they live. So I can't charge you to go vote, but I can make it very, very, very difficult by laws to make a voting poll out of your reach. I can do that. I might not be able to tax you, but I can make it very, very, very difficult for you to get to the nearest voting poll. All right. And some of this stuff is still going on. And the Supreme Court had to come back and say, your voting laws are unconstitutional. They are deliberately targeting people of color. They are deliberately targeting poor people. North Carolina and Texas. All right. New laws like the grandfather clause said only people whose grandfathers had voted in prior elections could vote. So if you're a new generation of voters, that automatically excludes you because you don't have a grandfather to call on to say they used to vote. All right. So again, certain laws, when they're put out there, this is why I like to say racism is spelled Policy. Certain laws don't have to say your name specifically, but I can build a law that automatically excludes you based on the qualifications for the law, like the grandfather clause. So maybe I didn't think I was racist, but if I'm looking and I realize a whole new generation of black people is rising up to vote, and I say in Reconstruction time, I say, oh, I'm going to make this rule where the only people who can vote are people who had a grandfather that voted. Well, then you know that most of these black people's grandfathers were either sharecroppers or slaves. So they wouldn't have been voting. They wouldn't have had the right yet. All right. So these kinds of laws would obviously make it impossible for black folks to vote. The North had won the Civil War, but the South won Reconstruction. All right. We're going to stop there. We did finish chapter 5. This is going to be interesting. Let's see. Next time, chapter 6. Chapter 6 is Cowboys and Indians. Oh, yeah. What did that actually mean? Cowboys and Indians. Native Americans and Westward Negroes. That's going to be our topic for next week. And if you're actually interested in the subject in detail, you can check out this book, Black Indians. Black Indians by A Hidden Heritage by William Loren Katz. Invaluable history. All right. It's my book recommendation for today. We're going to take our last just about 15 minutes to go into hopefully finishing up our piece on Asian immigration. So, remember we talked about John Wayne, just kidding. Remember we talked about how the Japanese immigrants who were Buddhist coming into the country began to upset Americans who didn't understand the religion. And the Buddhist bishop at the time, Koyo Uchida, in 1920, actually had to go before the House of Representatives Committee on Immigration to actually fight for them to be able to have the right to practice their religion in America. People don't talk about this. I don't know why we're not talking about this, but the Asian people in this country need to understand that just like we have a group of Americans that are like super anti-Muslim anything, we had a group of Americans who were anti-Japanese, who were anti-Buddhists. Can you believe it? Now you wouldn't even know that. All right? You wouldn't. Because for them, a lot of Asians are considered the model minority. But our history tells us that they were very hostile to people who practiced Buddhism. All right? Efforts like this with the Buddhist bishop going before the House of Representatives, efforts like this, which were designed to help Americans understand foreign cultures, did not seem to matter to Americans. After the 1924 Immigration Act went into effect, the United States would accept only 100 immigrants from Japan and China each year. Did you hear me? 100 people. These had to be eligible for citizenship, and Asians could not become citizens. That's a catch-22. This meant, in effect, that Europeans living in Asia could fill the quota, but not Asians themselves. Filipino immigrants. People from the Philippines faced a different situation. The United States acquired the Philippines after defeating Spain, which had owned the Philippines as a colony in the Spanish-American War in 1898. Filipinos then fought the United States for their independence, but instead became an American territory in 1902. Because of this, Filipinos were allowed to immigrate to the United States without restrictions, even after the quota law of 1924 went into effect. They came by ship straight from the Philippines and sometimes from Hawaii, landing at ports on the Pacific coast, including San Francisco and Portland, Oregon. Many Filipino immigrants worked on farms and helped with harvests in California. After they passed through a customs check, like American citizens, they could enter the country. Still, their lives were not easy. Many worked in seasonal farming, moving from place to place to pick and can fruits and vegetables. My friend Ninang and I cut spinach. We cut off the roots, wrote one 15-year-old Angeles Monreyo in 1928. First, we picked out the bad leaves and then the yellow and cut off the roots and put spinach leaves on a wide moving belt. We were paid 20 cents a crate for every crate we finished. Today, I finished 10 crates only, so I made $2 exactly. The women are all piece workers, especially the spinach cutters. The women who have been working in the cannery every year work faster, and so they make more money. Me, I am glad that I am working and that I made $2 today. 3 months later, drying apricots, Monreyo wrote, I don't know how long the fruits will last. I know I'm going to work as long as they, the landowners, keep us. Filipinos suffered the same discrimination that Chinese and Japanese immigrants did. In Stockton, California, where Angeles Monreyo lived, police patrolled the streets at night to keep Filipinos from entering the white neighborhoods. What? Police patrols? What? Okay. Signs on the hotels read, positively, no Filipinos allowed. So why were the police out at night and why were they patrolling? It was to protect property. Okay? And to protect white people from having their neighborhoods invaded. Tell me what's different. Somebody, anybody, tell me what's different. In 1934, Congress made the Philippines a commonwealth with a Filipino government effective in 1935. At the same time, it reduced the number of Filipinos who could immigrate to the United States to only 50 per year. Another sign of racial discrimination. The Philippines became fully independent from the United States in 1946 because they might as well become independent. Only 50 of them were allowed to come into the United States per year. Koreans and Indians immigrated to the United States in much smaller numbers. After Japan occupied Korea in 1905, Koreans came to Hawaii. About 1,000 immigrated to the U.S. mainland. Mary Pike Lee and her family were agricultural migrants. She was 6 years old when she came to the United States. In Riverside, California, she lived in a camp of one-room shacks with a few water pumps here and there and little sheds for outhouses. The shacks had been built for Chinese railroad workers in the 1880s. Her first day at school was a very frightening experience. As we entered the schoolyard, several girls formed a ring around us, singing a song and dancing in a circle. When they stopped, each one came over to me and hit me in the neck. Not knowing the Pike family was Korean, the American student sang as though she were Chinese. Ching Chong Chinaman sitting on a wall. Along came a white man and chopped his head off. That's what the school children were singing to the new Asian immigrant children. And then they would come over to them and hit them in the neck. And we think that this kind of behavior is new to our generation. So right after the election, when people were filming what was going on in elementary schools, and you saw young elementary school children chanting at Mexican American children, build that wall, we think this kind of behavior is new. It's not. All right? This is how things get passed on, sentiments in the mind about people who are quote unquote foreigner or other. It keeps getting passed down. The last line was a signal for each girl to chop my head off by giving me a blow on the neck, wrote Pike. Moving to Northern California, the Pike family encountered more prejudice. But in Claremont, California, Pike had her first experience with the American way of living. The new house had several rooms with beds. The kitchen had a gas stove, electric lights, and a sink with faucets for cold and hot water. For the first time, I finally felt glad that we had come to America. Living in the United States was a combination of opportunity and discrimination. We often talk about America being the land of opportunity, but we don't want to talk about the discrimination that people endured, right, to come find this quote unquote opportunity. Pike stood up to her high school history teacher. When we came to the pages about China and Japan, he referred to them as the lands of stinking Chinks and dirty Japs. He said that Korea was a wild, savage country that had been civilized by the Japs. That was the last straw. I walked up to him and said, "Where did you learn Asian history? You don't know a thing about the subject." Young-Hil Kang was a Korean who came to the United States in 1921. Before passage of the Immigration Act. As a teenager, he was interested in European and American science and culture. I studied with concentration. I studied with all the self-denial and earnestness of my father. I studied with all the brains of my many ancestors who had been scholars and poets and officials beyond count and number. I began to learn the law of gravitation, the study of the lives of Lincoln and Napoleon, and the geography of the world kindled my enthusiasm until sometimes I just seemed to be dazzled by the stars in my head. He wrote in the novel The Grass Roof. Kang became a professor at New York University. This is a picture of Raymond Song-Her, 1918. He was a Korean American who played football for the YMCA College, now known as Aurora University in Illinois. Often the children of immigrants learned English and assimilated into American society more easily than their parents. And that is just an image of him there. All right. Immigrants from India came with the same desire to improve their lives. Do you wonder when you look at India with its low wages and high taxes, its famines and plagues, absence of all incentive toward advancement, that the dam which for so long has held the people in check is weakening? asked an article in the Pacific Monthly magazine in 1907. Do you wonder that the East Indians are turning their faces westward toward the land of progress and opportunity? But by 1920, only about 6,400 immigrants from India had come to the United States. Despite their small numbers, some Americans worried that they were too different to become true Americans. The civic and social question concerns the ability of the nation to assimilate this class of Hindus and their probable effect upon the communities where they settle. The Hindu, the newest immigration problem. This was actually in a magazine called The Survey. Their habits, their lack of home life, no women being among them, and their effect upon standards of labor and wages all combine to raise a serious question as to whether the doors should be kept open or closed against this strange new stream. The question was answered by the Immigration Act of 1917, passed by Congress over President Woodrow Wilson's veto. It banned specific kinds of people, including idiots and criminals, from entering the United States. It also created the Asiatic Barred Zone, which prevented immigration not only from India, but also from most of Asia and the Pacific Islands as well. The Asiatic Barred Zone was a powerful symbol of American prejudice and racism. In 1946, the Luce-Celler Act allowed Asian Indians and Filipinos to immigrate to the United States, but only 100 a year. It also finally made Asian Indians and Filipinos eligible for citizenship. So, the experience of Asian immigrants in Hawaii was different from that of those who came to the U.S. mainland. More than 300,000 people from China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines had come between 1850 and 1920. Many started out as contract workers in the sugarcane fields run by American companies. The life was hard. We worked like machines, said one laborer. We were watched constantly. A Korean woman remembered a foreman who would gallop around on horseback and crack and snap his whip. Because the workers came from different countries in Asia, they often lived in separate communities. It was difficult for them to organize for workers' rights. But in the early 1900s, there were some successful strikes. More and more Asian immigrants decided to make Hawaii their permanent home. Why? Why? Because it was easier to stay in Hawaii than it was to come to the U.S. mainland. So when people wonder, why are there so many Asian descent people in Hawaii? Again, it goes back to policy. All right. Although Hawaii became a U.S. territory in 1898, it did not become a state until 1959. Racism was a factor. By 1920, Asians made up 62% of the population. After the World War II, American attitudes began to change. There's a higher percentage of people living in Hawaii who are Asians or their descendants than any other state. And that is for a reason, because of all of these policies that made it difficult for them if they came to mainland United States. That's why. Not because they enjoyed the beaches and the waves more than any other part of the United States, all right? It was not just because Hawaii is beautiful and they just felt like staying there. There were policies in place that kept them confined to a certain area. So when we think about that in terms of Black America and the policies that keep us confined to certain areas, certain cities, certain states where the majority of Black people tend to live, it goes back to policy and not wanting to be harassed while you're simply trying to live and exist in a country. Perhaps the most controversial discrimination against the Asian group in the United States occurred during World War II, from 1939 to 1945. Fighting had already begun in Asia and Europe. In December 1941, after Japanese troops bombed the American base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, The United States went to war against Japan. Many in the Pacific Coast states believed that the Japanese would attack them. They also believed that Japanese immigrants called the Issei and their American-born children called the Nisei sabotaged the American war effort. California, Oregon, and Washington actually pressed for action against the Japanese. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 calling for Japanese Americans living within 100 miles of the Pacific Ocean to be interned in camps. And if you believe that this same thing cannot happen to other people groups in this country, all of a sudden, they had nothing to do with the war, but all of a sudden, they are now presidentially ordered to go to a concentration camp or a work camp or a prison camp, however you want to call it. So, in Hawaii, which had a large Japanese population, only a small number of them were interned. However, most Japanese immigrants and their descendants were too important to the island's economy, including agricultural production, which is why they didn't intern a whole lot of them there. American-born Monica Sohn, whose parents were Japanese immigrants, remembered a family going to the control station to register the family. He came home with 20 tags, all numbered 10710. The tags were attached to each piece of luggage and one to hang from their coat lapels. Then they were known as Family 10710. They were tagged like property and luggage. Some wrote the 1953 autobiography Nisei Daughter. Between 1942 and 1945, 110,000 Japanese Americans, including citizens like Sohn, were removed from their homes. Many lost their homes and possessions because this is what America does. And they were imprisoned in rough internment camps. Most of the camps were in the desert. No houses were in sight, no trees or anything green. Only sagebrush and cactus and mostly dry, baked earth. The United States was also at war with Germany and Italy, but only a few thousand Germans and Italians were interned. They were released before the Japanese were. Racism and prejudice clearly played a part in the decision to intern Japanese Americans. Despite this action, many Japanese Americans still volunteered and fought for the United States in World War II. Other Asians have immigrated to the United States since then. The numbers were small until the 1970s, when Vietnamese and other Southeast Asians fled the results of war and political persecution. Prevented from coming to the United States for years, Asians nonetheless became one of two groups who make up the majority of immigrants to this country in the first decades of the 21st century. Latin Americans are the other group. So I want to show you, as we close today, I want to show you a couple of the images here. These are the Sikh immigrants from India working on the railroad in Oregon. All right. There they are. And these are the Japanese Americans who think that they're leaving for a camp, and they think that everything's going to be all right. But as we know, some of these people lost their lives during that time. They lost their land, they lost their homes, they lost their possessions. And guess what? That was for a few years. Not 240. And guess what? Our government gave them reparations. So you don't hear the Japanese complaining because our government gave them reparations. When we come back next week, we're going to start on our next section, which is Latin American immigrants south of the border. All right. So I want to thank you for allowing me to go over today because I wanted to make sure we finish that chapter. This has been another episode of Daring Dialogues. I hope that I have said something today that will help you start making the connection between present day issues and issues of the past. What is it about our processes that have not changed? What is it about the way that we treat immigrants that has not changed, that needs to change? What is it about the way that we view others that has not changed, that needs to change? Can you identify some of the sentiments, some of the same kinds of policies that people are trying to put forth today, saying that they want a better America? What does that actually mean? Are they saying they want a better America? Are they saying they want people of color to be limited in this country? Are they saying that they want to open up the country? Are they saying that the people who are already here have too much quote unquote freedom and access and opportunity, and they want to start going back to limit that so that it will only give one certain group of people an advantage? What exactly are we trying to return America to? All right. These are things that we need to think about. We need to consider. We need to understand. All right. So again, I want to thank you for your time and attention. Please feel free to hit the share button. If you have a question about any of the information that I presented today, please feel free to email me. My email is in the bio. It's also located at the top of my YouTube page as well, in the little contact section of my YouTube page. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so please go out today and be light. Thank you again for your time and attention. We all know somebody needs to hear this message, so please share it. All right? Don't keep it to yourself. Share this message. Share it with your Asian friends. All right? Some of them, for some reason, do not know this history, and they need to know it. All right? Thank you again. Take care, and God bless.